I've worked many years in the gym, and I've had a lot of people come up to me and complain that someone is taking too long during their rest periods and hogging the equipment. Sometimes this person is right, and the other person is just distracted on their phone and resting for way too long. But sometimes the person that is resting for the appropriate amount of time, and the other person's just being impatient. When the gym is busy, the time we take in between sets can come under scrutiny. But how long should we take in between sets, and what does the science say? But first, let me introduce myself. My name is Logan. I'm a master's student studying human performance and strength and conditioning. How long you should rest in between your sets depends on your goals, the intensity of the weight you're using, and your overall fitness level. Today we're going to go over what the standard rest intervals are, and then we're going to cover a study that indicates that the proper rest intervals may be different than what the conventional wisdom says. So be sure to watch to the end. First, let's talk about how rest intervals may be influenced by your goals. According to the National Strength and Conditioning Association, or the NSCA, when training for muscular endurance, you want to rest anywhere from 30 seconds or less between sets. Whereas if you're training for hypertrophy or muscle growth, you'd rest anywhere from 30 to 90 seconds. If you're training for strength or power, longer rest periods are typically recommended and should be anywhere from 2 to 5 minutes. Typically, the higher the intensity of the set and the closer you push towards failure, the longer you should rest in between sets. This is common sense to most people. If you finish a set and you didn't struggle at all and you still feel fresh, you can probably afford to start the next set a little bit sooner. And you can probably also increase the weight next set. On the other hand, if you finish a set and you gave it everything you had, you're fatigued, your muscles are burning, you can probably afford to rest a little bit longer before starting the next set. This also applies to the amount of muscles used during a lift. For example, I would take a lot longer to rest after a squat because I'm using my quads, my hamstrings, my glutes, my spinal erectors, versus a leg extension where I take a lot shorter rest because I am only using my quads during that exercise. Another example of this would be a bench press compared to a chest fly. I would take a lot longer of a rest in between sets of a bench press because I'd be working pecs, my deltoids, my triceps, versus a chest fly where I would only be working the pecs. I would take a lot shorter of a rest. This especially applies to exercises that are axially loaded or any time where the spine is being loaded, such as back squats, deadlifts, and overhead presses. Due to the axial loading of these exercises, we may need to rest longer than exercises that work these same muscles but aren't axially loaded. So an example of this would be a back squat would be an axially loaded exercise, but a belt squat would work all the same musculature but not be axially loaded. On a side note, muscle hypertrophy or muscle growth occurs when a sufficient stimulus in the form of mechanical overload causes muscle protein synthesis, which causes the muscle fibers to get bigger and then the muscle as a whole to also get bigger. This means that as long as we are pushing sufficiently close enough to failure, typically around 1 to 3 reps away from failure, we can signal muscle hypertrophy to occur. If your goal is hypertrophy or muscle growth, you don't need to push to failure all the time, but you should be close, at least within that 1 to 3 reps away from failure, pretty often. Although I am an advocate of going to failure occasionally because it is beneficial, in my opinion, to remind yourself what true failure feels like. If you go too long without experiencing failure, our perception of what failure feels like shifts, and what used to feel like 1 to 3 reps away may be further away than we realize, and we might not be pushing as hard as we think. Occasionally pushing to failure resets our perception and allows us to accurately stay within the 1 to 3 reps away from failure most of the time. As far as how many reps to do when you're training for hypertrophy, most of the literature indicates that doing anywhere from 5 to 30 reps is equally as effective as long as you're pushing sufficiently close to failure. Muscle strength also increases in the same way. However, it's not limited to only the physiological adaptations. A lot of strength also comes from neurological adaptations and is largely dependent on our nervous system. When we're training for strength, we typically want to stay under 6 reps. This means that just because our muscles get bigger does not mean that we are getting stronger, and it also means the opposite of we can get stronger without getting any bigger. There is a large correlation between the two, muscle strength and size, but it is not a perfect correlation. While the time intervals I listed prior in the video are pretty standard, I want to talk about a study by Brad Schoenfield and colleagues titled Interset Rest Periods Enhance Muscle Strength and Hypertrophy in Resistance-Trained Men. The title of the study really gives away what they found. This study recruited 23 male participants to participate in an 8-week resistance training program that consisted of 3 full body workouts every week. They were tested before and after the 8-week resistance training program, And they were tested for a 1 rep max bench press, a 1 rep max back squat, and between each 1 rep max attempt, they were given 3 to 5 minutes of rest. They also tested for muscular endurance via a bench press at 50% of their 1 rep max, where the participants were loaded up with half of the weight they could do as a maximum and did as many reps as they could. They also measured the cross-sectional area of the muscle via an ultrasound, and they measured the biceps, triceps, and the quads. During the workouts, they did 7 exercises. They did 3 sets of 8 to 12 reps for each exercise, and each set was taken to failure within that 8 to 12 rep range. Each rep consisted of a 1 second concentric or muscle shortening, followed by a 2 second eccentric or muscle lengthening. The weights were adjusted throughout the sets to ensure the participants stayed within that 8 to 12 rep range. The exercises they performed for the lower body included a barbell back squat, a plate-loaded leg press, and a plate-loaded leg extension. The exercises they did for the upper body included a flat barbell bench press, a seated barbell military press, a plate-loaded lat pull-down, and a plate-loaded cable row. For the rest periods during the resistance training program, the participants were split up into 2 groups. The short group rested 1 minute between sets, and the long group rested 3 minutes in between sets. Okay, so what did they find? They found that for muscle thickness, the biceps in the long group increased the muscle thickness by 5.4%, whereas the bicep thickness in the short group only increased by 2.8%. They found that the triceps thickness in the long group increased by 7%, whereas the triceps thickness in the short group only increased by 0.5%. And they found in the quads, the anterior quadriceps muscle increased by 13.3% in the long group, whereas only 6.9% in the short group. However, there wasn't much of a difference in the vastus lateralis between groups, with the long group increasing muscle thickness by 11.5%, whereas the short group was pretty close with 10%. For muscle strength, the long group increased their 1 rep max squat by 15.2%, whereas the short group only increased their 1 rep max back squat by 7.6%. In terms of 1 rep max bench press, the long group saw an increase of 12.7%, whereas the short group saw an increase of 4.1%. For muscular endurance, they found that the number of reps that the long group could do was increased by 23.2%, whereas the short group increased the number of reps they could do by 13%. Okay, so what does this mean? This study indicates that there's a clear benefit to resting for longer rest intervals when training for strength. In the 1 rep max back squat, the long group improved twice as much as the short group, and in the 1 rep max bench press, the long group improved over 3 times as much as the short group. In terms of muscle thickness, there is much less of a difference between the short and long groups. The long group experienced greater improvements in muscle thickness in all the muscles tested comparatively to the short group. However, only the differences in muscle thickness of the anterior quad were statistically significant. For the biceps and the triceps, the differences were not statistically significant. However, the effect sizes and the p-values both favored the longer group and show that there may have been a trend and show that the results may have been statistically significant if there were more participants or if the resistance training program lasted longer than 8 weeks. This means that 1 minute of rest may be too short to maximize hypertrophy, but it doesn't necessarily show that 3 minutes is the most optimal either. And in terms of muscular endurance, even though the long group improved more than the short group, it was not statistically significant. In conclusion, this study indicates that longer rest periods may be more optimal than short rest periods for optimizing muscle strength, hypertrophy, and endurance. However, longer rest periods will have the greatest impact on training for strength and a lesser impact when training for endurance or hypertrophy. There is one last key factor that we need to take away from this study though. The long group took twice as long to finish their workout as the short group. For most people, time is a big limitation in the gym. Spending 90 minutes to 2 hours in the gym just isn't an option. In this regard, short rest periods may be the better choice. If you only have an hour or less to spend in the gym, you'd be better off getting a full workout in by doing short rest periods than only getting half a workout and then running out of time. Especially if your goal is to gain muscle or endurance, the time you would save doing short rest periods may outweigh the cost of doing long rest periods. However, if your goals are more strength focused, it may be worth it to take longer rest periods due to the huge difference that longer rest periods made. This study also only compared 1 minute of rest to 3 minutes of rest, and showed that 3 minutes was more optimal. However, they didn't test anything other than those two, so 2 minutes might be a sweet spot for most people. Hopefully most people are still watching at this point of the video, because this might have been the key takeaway. There are also ways to increase your rest periods without increasing the total duration of your workout. For example, supersets and circuits can allow one muscle group to rest while you train a different muscle group. For example, you can do a bicep curl and a tricep extension, and while your biceps are resting, you can train your triceps and vice versa. If you're interested in learning more about supersets or circuits, comment below and let me know. If you enjoyed watching this video, please consider subscribing. You can do that by clicking the button here, or if you want to watch another video that YouTube thinks you'll enjoy, you can do that by clicking here. Thanks for watching, and if you have any comments or questions, or want me to review any other topics in the field, please comment below.